Some lessons in life don't arrive wrapped in light. They come cloaked in shadows, whispering to us when we least want to hear them. They tell us that love can mean sacrifice, that sacrifice can feel like loss, and that loss, when endured with grace, may one day be the seed of something greater. Angela Johnson had long ago made peace with shadows. At 50 years old, she had known more night shifts than sunsets, more empty chairs than embraces, more silence at the dinner table than laughter. Life had not been fair, but she had never asked it to be. She only asked for strength. It had been 10 years since her husband, Daniel, was taken from her in a construction accident. One ordinary morning, he kissed her on the cheek, grabbed his lunch pail, and promised to be home by 6. By noon, Angela was answering a call that split her life cleanly in two. Since then, she had walked alone. Alone, but not without purpose. She had Marcus and Chloe, her children, her anchors in a storm that refused to pass. By day, she scrubbed offices and hallways, her knees aching as the scent of bleach clung to her skin. By night, she stocked shelves in a corner grocery, her eyes burning under fluorescent lights. Angela measured time not by hours but by paychecks, each one swallowed whole by rent, utilities, and the endless drip of debt. "Mom, you can't keep doing this," Chloe had said one evening, her voice a mixture of admiration and worry. 17 and sharp-eyed, Chloe carried her mother's resilience, but also a hunger Angela feared she couldn't feed. Chloe wanted college, scholarships, a life bigger than Detroit's crumbling blocks. Angela wanted it for her too, she just didn't know how to make the math work. Marcus, on the other hand, had lost his fire. At 24, he drifted like smoke, too heavy to rise, too shapeless to catch. He had tried jobs, warehouse work, deliveries, even a short stint at a mechanic's shop, but nothing held him. "They don't respect me," he often muttered, his bitterness rising with every rejection. Angela worried about the company he kept, young men who lingered on corners with idle hands and sharper tongues. One night, as Angela returned from her shift, she found Marcus on the porch with 3 of them, laughing too loudly, a bottle passing from hand to hand. She froze in the shadows before they noticed her. The sight pierced her heart in a way that scrubbing floors never could. Inside, Chloe was bent over a notebook, a stack of textbooks spread around her like soldiers ready for battle. Her hair was tied back, her pencil moving quickly, the quiet rhythm of a girl who believed in her future. Angela looked at her daughter, then thought of her son outside, and a deep ache settled into her chest. This was the cruel arithmetic of her life: 2 children, 2 paths, and her stretched body trying to hold both. She sat at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples, whispering a prayer. "Lord, give me just enough strength to see them through. I don't need riches, I don't need comfort, just let them be okay." The refrigerator hummed in reply. The walls held their silence. Detroit had not been kind. Once it had been the city of engines and hope, where her father worked the assembly line and her mother carried fresh bread home from the corner bakery. Now, boarded-up windows lined the streets, and dreams leaked out as fast as the jobs had. Angela knew all too well the statistics for young black men like Marcus. She had buried neighbors' sons, heard the sirens at night, felt the way fear walked beside her when the sun went down. Yet she also knew the power of one choice, one open door, one helping hand. She had seen it in Chloe's teachers who stayed late, in the church choir that pooled money for her husband's funeral, in the neighbor who shoveled her driveway after a blizzard. Grace was rare, but it was real, and sometimes it came when least expected. That night, Marcus stumbled in, eyes glassy, shoulders slumped. Chloe shot him a glare but said nothing. Angela rose from her chair, her tired hands smoothing the wrinkles in her thrift store blouse. "Marcus," she said softly, "sit with me." He sighed, dropped into the chair across from her, and rubbed his face. For a moment, Angela saw the little boy he once was, the boy who used to run home with drawings of fire trucks and astronauts. "I'm trying, Ma," he whispered, not looking at her. But it feels like everything's against me. Angela reached across the table, her palm rough from years of scrubbing, and laid it over his hand. The world may be against you, but I am not. Don't forget that. You are still your father's son. You are still my boy. For a second, his eyes softened. Then the hardness returned, the wall of a young man ashamed of needing his mother. He pulled his hand away and muttered, "Yes, we'll see." He left for his room, the door closing with a thud. Angela sat back, her heart heavy but unbroken. Chloe reached over, placing her delicate fingers on Angela's wrist. "Mom, don't worry, he'll come around, he has to." Angela forced a smile. "I hope so, baby, I hope so." As the night stretched on, Angela lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her body begged for rest, but her mind refused. She thought of Marcus's anger, Chloe's ambition, the unpaid bills on the counter. She thought of Daniel, gone 10 years, but still the last face she saw before sleep. Her life was a seesaw, always tilting between despair and hope. And though despair pressed heavier, Angela clung to hope with the quiet stubbornness of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Because love, when it is stripped bare, is not about ease. It is about endurance. And Angela Johnson, weary as she was, had endured. What she did not yet know was that her endurance was about to be tested in ways she could not imagine. And that beyond the dark horizon of her suffering, something unexpected waited, ready to change everything. The notice came on a Thursday afternoon, slipped under the front door in an envelope that smelled faintly of ink and dust. Angela didn't need to open it to know what it was. She had seen enough of them in her life: letters from landlords, bills with red stamps, warnings dressed as polite requests. Still, she tore the flap with trembling fingers. Final eviction notice. 30 days. 30 days to find another roof for her children. 30 days to turn a life already stitched together with desperation into something resembling stability. She folded the paper neatly, as if order could tame chaos, and placed it on the counter beside a pile of unpaid bills. Chloe saw it first. Her daughter's face tightened, the pencil slipping from her hand. "Mom?" Angela shook her head. "Don't, baby, not now." But Marcus wasn't as quiet. He came into the kitchen, reading the notice over her shoulder, his jaw clenched. "I knew it," he snapped. "We can't keep living like this. You're killing yourself at 2 jobs, and for what? For us to get kicked out like trash? Maybe if you'd let Chloe handle her own college dreams instead of forcing it." "Marcus!" Angela's voice cut sharper than she intended. His words had sliced deep, and her heart ached before she could even catch her breath. Chloe shot her brother a look. "Don't you dare put this on Mom. She's the only reason we've made it this far." Marcus's laughter was bitter. "Yeah, well, maybe her way isn't working anymore. Maybe I need to do things my way." Angela felt the room tilt. Her son's voice no longer carried the tired frustration of youth. It carried something darker, heavier, as though he had already made peace with losing hope. He stormed out, the screen door banging against its frame. Chloe bent down, gathering her notebooks, her face wet with angry tears. Angela touched her daughter's shoulder, but Chloe pulled away, not from resentment, but because she didn't want her mother to feel how much she was shaking. That night, Angela walked home from her second job. The grocery aisles had swallowed her until midnight, and now the streets stretched long and empty. The air smelled of wet concrete and fried food from a diner down the block. Her shoes pinched her swollen feet, and her back ached with the dull throb of exhaustion. As she crossed the parking lot of a rundown strip mall, she heard a sharp thud. Then a groan. Ahead, a man lay awkwardly beside a silver sedan, his briefcase sprawled open, papers scattered across the pavement like startled birds. Angela hurried over. "Sir, are you all right?" The man was older, maybe in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back. His suit was expensive, though now smeared with dust. He clutched his ankle, his face pale. "I slipped," he muttered, trying to sit up. Angela dropped to her knees beside him, her work uniform smelling faintly of detergent and sweat. "Don't move too quickly, you might have twisted something." She gathered the scattered papers, her hands quick and sure, then offered her arm to help him steady. For a moment, their eyes met, hers dark and steady despite the fatigue, his blue and clouded with embarrassment. "Thank you," he said softly, as though unused to needing help. "I don't usually." "No one does," Angela replied. "Let's get you standing." Together, they managed to ease him upright. His weight leaned into her more than he wanted to admit, and she bore it with the quiet strength of someone who had carried far heavier burdens. He nodded toward the diner. "Could I trouble you for a seat? Just until I catch my breath?" Angela guided him inside. The waitress glanced at them but said nothing as she led him to a booth. When the man had settled, he extended his hand. "Charles Anderson." Angela hesitated, then shook it. "Angela Johnson." "Angela," he repeated as if tasting the name. "I owe you more than I can say. If you hadn't come along, you'd have managed," she said with a faint smile. "People always do." Charles studied her, the lines around his eyes deepening. There was something in her tone, not bitterness, not pride, but a weary knowledge. She stood to leave, but he stopped her. "Please let me buy you something. Coffee, a meal?" Angela shook her head. "I should get home. My kids are waiting." Charles didn't press. Instead, he handed her a business card, the paper thick and embossed. "At least let me give you this if you ever need anything." Angela slipped the card into her pocket without looking. "Take care of that ankle," she said, and with that she stepped back into the night. The city was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. Angela walked home slower than usual, her mind heavy. She thought of Marcus's anger, Chloe's dreams, the eviction notice waiting on the counter. She thought of the man in the suit, grateful yet awkward, his eyes carrying a loneliness she recognized. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she had stopped to help Charles Anderson would ripple through the rest of her life. It was the kind of moment that seemed small at first, but in time would prove to be the hinge on which her story turned. At home, Chloe had fallen asleep on her books, a pen still clutched in her hand. Marcus's room was dark, his bed untouched. Angela pulled a blanket over her daughter's shoulders and sank into the worn sofa, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Her eyes closed, but her thoughts raced. A month to find shelter, a son slipping away, a daughter reaching too high, and the faint, unexpected kindness of a stranger whose name she had just learned. The wall of despair was closing in, but even walls, Angela believed, sometimes had cracks. And through those cracks, a sliver of light could fall. Angela didn't look at the card again. She had tucked it into her purse, behind expired coupons and grocery receipts, and told herself it didn't matter. People like Charles Anderson lived in a world she only glimpsed through the fogged windows of downtown high-rises or glossy magazines at the checkout line. His life was pressed suits and fine dinners. Hers was laundromats and bus schedules. But life has a strange way of circling back. A week after the eviction notice, Angela came home from her morning job to find Chloe sitting at the kitchen table with wide eyes and flushed cheeks. "Mom," she said, clutching a folded piece of paper. "Someone came by while you were gone." Angela's chest tightened. "Was it the landlord?" Chloe shook her head. "No, it was him, the man you helped, Charles." Angela frowned, setting down her cleaning bucket. "What did he want?" "He just asked if you were home. When I said no, he gave me this." Chloe pushed the envelope across the table. Angela hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a note written in a neat hand. "Dear Angela, I hope you'll forgive my intrusion. I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness the other night. Would you allow me the honor of treating you and your children to dinner this weekend? No obligations, just gratitude. Sincerely, Charles Anderson." Angela read it twice, her pulse unsteady. Dinner. Gratitude. She could almost hear Marcus's voice in her head. "He's pitying you, Ma." But Chloe was already glowing. "Mom, he seemed really nice. And his car was, well, not like anything we've ever seen up close. Why not go, just once?" Angela rubbed her forehead. Because people like him don't invite people like us to dinner without a reason. Maybe the reason, Chloe said softly, is just that you helped him. Angela didn't answer. She folded the note carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and left it on the counter. That evening, when Marcus returned, Angela decided to tell him, if only to keep honesty between them. "Dinner?" he barked, his voice laced with scorn. "With some old rich guy? You really think he just wants to thank you?" Chloe rolled her eyes. "Not everyone has an agenda, Marcus." "You're so naive," he shot back. "Guys like him don't look twice at women like Mom unless they want something. Money, company, whatever. You think the world suddenly got generous?" Angela held up her hand, weary of their sparring. "Enough," he offered, "that's all. And I haven't said yes." Marcus scoffed, slamming his bedroom door. Angela leaned against the counter, her heart heavy. But when she caught Chloe's hopeful gaze, she realized she wanted her daughter to see something different, something other than struggle and disappointment. 2 nights later, they stood outside a restaurant Angela had only ever passed by on buses, its windows glowing with warm light, its doorway lined with polished brass. Charles was waiting inside, dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming. "Angela," he greeted warmly, his smile unforced. "And you must be Chloe, Marcus." Marcus gave a curt nod, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his suspicion visible in every line of his posture. Chloe, on the other hand, beamed and shook Charles's hand eagerly. The table was set with linen napkins and glasses that caught the light like prisms. Angela sat stiffly, conscious of her thrift store dress and work-roughened hands, but Charles spoke gently, asking Chloe about school, Marcus about his interests. Chloe lit up when talking about college, her dream of studying journalism. Charles listened intently, as though her words carried the weight of stock portfolios. "That's a noble pursuit," he said, nodding. "The world needs more truth-tellers." Marcus muttered something about the world not caring, but Charles didn't flinch. He only gave the young man a patient glance, as if he saw beyond the bitterness. As plates arrived, steaks and salmon, far beyond anything Angela had ever ordered, she found herself softening. It wasn't the food. It was the way Charles treated them, not as charity cases, but as people worthy of his time. Halfway through the meal, he leaned slightly toward Angela. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your children are remarkable. Chloe's determination, Marcus's fire, it's clear they come from you." Angela blinked back sudden tears. Compliments were rare in her life, rarer still when they felt sincere, but Marcus shifted sharply in his seat. "We're doing fine on our own," he said, his voice hard. "We don't need handouts." "Marcus," Angela whispered. "No, Ma, he should know we don't need saving." For a long moment, the table was silent. Then Charles set down his fork. His voice was calm, steady. "I didn't come here to save anyone," he said. "I came here because someone saved me when I needed help. I've built companies and signed contracts, but that night, it was your mother who noticed me. Your mother who lifted me up. That kind of strength deserves to be honored." Marcus looked away, jaw tight. Chloe reached for her mother's hand under the table, squeezing it. When dinner ended, Charles walked them to the door. Outside, the Detroit night was sharp with wind, neon lights buzzing in the distance. "Angela," he said softly, handing her another envelope. "This isn't charity, it's an investment for Chloe. Please look at it." She shook her head. "Mr. Anderson." "Charles," he corrected gently. "Please." He placed the envelope in her hand and stepped back toward his car. At home, Angela opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a cashier's check, the number almost unreal, tuition for Chloe's first year of college. Angela pressed the paper to her chest, her mind reeling. Gratitude swelled, tangled with fear. Nothing in her life had come without cost. And yet, what if this was the crack in the wall she had prayed for? From Marcus's room came the faint thrum of angry music. From the kitchen, Chloe's hopeful whisper, "Mom, this could change everything." Angela sat in the quiet house, caught between her son's suspicion and her daughter's dreams, the check heavy in her hands. And for the first time in years, she wondered if hope could be trusted. The check sat in a plain envelope on the kitchen counter, as if it were no different than the grocery list beneath it. But Angela couldn't stop glancing at it, as though the numbers inked on that paper might burn a hole through her floor. Chloe treated it like a treasure, running her fingers over the smooth edge every time she passed. Marcus, however, wouldn't even look at it. 3 days after the dinner, Angela found him in the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "You can't take his money, Ma," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "You don't know him, you don't know what he really wants." Angela rubbed her tired eyes. "Marcus, all he wants is to help." "Help," Marcus laughed bitterly. "Nobody just helps, not men like him. He sees a woman struggling and thinks he can swoop in, play hero, and you're letting him." "Stop it," Angela said firmly. "This isn't about me, it's about Chloe. That check could send her to college." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And what about me? What do I get? What does he think of me, some jobless loser? A charity case he can write off in his taxes." Angela's voice softened. "Marcus, no one thinks that. You're my son, But he cut her off. "Yeah, your son who doesn't matter as much as Chloe, because she's the smart one, the perfect one. She's worth saving. Me, I'm just in the way." The words sliced deeper than he knew. Angela opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For years, she had bent her back and bruised her hands for both her children, but Marcus's eyes burned with the belief that he had been forgotten. Chloe, who had been standing in the doorway, stepped forward. "That's not fair, Marcus. Mom's been breaking herself for us both. Don't you dare say she doesn't care." Marcus turned on her. "Easy for you to say, little Miss College girl. You're the reason she's killing herself. You're the reason she'll take money from some stranger." Chloe's cheeks flushed. "At least I'm trying to build a life. What are you doing? Hanging out with guys who do nothing but drag you down?" The argument ignited like gasoline. Voices rose, words grew sharper. Angela felt the walls of the house tremble under the weight of their anger. She slammed her hand against the table. "Enough!" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Angela stood tall, though her heart was breaking. "You are both my children," she said, her voice steady. "I won't let money, his or anyone else's, tear this family apart. Marcus, I love you. Chloe, I love you, but I won't let your bitterness or your dreams turn into weapons." Marcus looked at her, his eyes glistening with something between anger and sorrow. Then he stormed out, the front door rattling behind him. Chloe sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "Mom, I didn't mean." Angela placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I know, but your brother is hurting, and hurt people don't always speak sense." That night, Angela sat awake long after Chloe had gone to bed. She stared at the check, at the promise of a future she couldn't provide on her own. It felt like hope wrapped in chains, too heavy to hold, too dangerous to release. The next day, Angela went to work with red eyes and a leaden heart. The offices she cleaned gleamed with glass and marble, each desk holding family photos in silver frames. She wondered if any of those families fought over love the way hers did, if their dinners ended in slammed doors and silent tears. During her lunch break, her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. "Angela Johnson?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Charles Anderson. Forgive me for calling you at work. I wanted to know if everything was all right. You seemed unsettled the other night." Angela swallowed hard. "You didn't need to call." "I know," he said gently, "but I wanted to. I know what it is to live with silence and regret. If I can offer anything, just kindness, I want to." His words disarmed her, not because of their generosity, but because of the sadness beneath them. It was the sadness of someone who had also lost, who understood how grief reshapes a life. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. "But my family is complicated." "Most families are," he replied. "Don't close the door on help just because it feels strange." When she hung up, Angela sat for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the polished floor. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her not as a worker, not as a mother stretched thin, but simply as a woman. That evening, Marcus didn't come home. Chloe studied at the kitchen table, her pencil scratching furiously against paper, as if she could erase her brother's anger with each equation solved. Angela cooked a pot of beans and rice, setting 3 plates though only 2 would be filled. She whispered a prayer over the empty chair, her voice trembling. "Bring him back to me, Lord. Don't let me lose him too." Later, as she cleared the dishes, Chloe slipped her arms around her mother's waist. "We'll be okay, Mom," she murmured. Angela closed her eyes, resting her cheek against her daughter's hair. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that one stranger's kindness wouldn't rip her family further apart. But as the night deepened and the house fell silent, Angela knew the truth. Their home was no longer united. Marcus's anger had drawn a line down the center of their lives, and Angela was standing directly on the fault. It started with a whisper at the corner store. Angela had gone in for bread and milk, her hair tied back beneath a scarf, her uniform smelling faintly of disinfectant. She could feel the eyes before she heard the words. 2 women from church, bent over a basket of fruit, their voices pitched low but not low enough. "That's her, isn't it, the Johnson widow? I heard she's got herself a man now, a rich one, driving her around town like she's some kind of queen." Angela froze by the dairy case. They didn't look at her, but their voices wrapped around her like nettles. "You know how it goes," one of them continued. "Woman like her, struggling all those years, it don't take much for her to grab the first dollar that walks by." The other laughed softly. "Poor Daniel's rolling in his grave, God rest his soul." Angela set the milk down, her hands trembling. Her face burned though no one had said her name aloud. She walked out empty-handed, the cold air outside biting her skin. By the time she reached home, the whispers had spread faster than winter wind. A neighbor waved politely, but with a smirk that lingered too long. Another turned her head when Angela passed. At church on Sunday, the stares were sharper. The pew where Angela and her children had sat for years suddenly felt exposed. The choir's hymn lifted high, but the murmurs carried beneath it like an undercurrent. Marcus felt it too. He clenched his fists when a man outside muttered, "Guess we know how they're paying for college." That night, he erupted. "This is exactly what I said would happen," he shouted, pacing the living room. "He's turned us into a spectacle. People think you're—" He couldn't finish, his disgust choking the words. "Marcus, stop," Angela pleaded. "No, you stop, Ma, don't you see? He's using you. Maybe he writes a check for Chloe, maybe he plays saint, but what do we look like to everyone else? Beggars, worse than beggars." Chloe shot up from the table, her textbook scattering. "You don't know him. He's kind, he's respectful. You think Mom hasn't sacrificed enough. Maybe she deserves someone treating her like she matters." Marcus turned on her, his eyes blazing. "And what about Dad, huh? You just erase him. Forget everything he was because some suit with a fat wallet shows up." The room split down the middle. Chloe trembling with anger, Marcus vibrating with rage, and Angela in between, her heart pulled until it nearly tore. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. The house, once noisy with her children's laughter, now echoed with bitterness. Later that week, as Angela walked to work, she overheard 2 young men outside a barber's shop. "Hey, that's the lady. Got herself a sugar daddy now." Laughter followed. Angela kept walking, her spine straight, but each word pressed into her like a bruise. When she reached the office building, she ducked into the restroom and locked the stall. For the first time in months, she cried, not the quiet tears she shed at night, but a raw sob that shook her chest. She cried for Daniel, whose memory now felt tarnished by rumor. She cried for Marcus, whose anger grew heavier each day. She cried for Chloe, whose dreams carried the weight of all their sacrifices. Most of all, she cried for herself, for the loneliness, for the way kindness had turned into condemnation, for the exhaustion of being judged no matter what choice she made. That evening, Charles called. His voice was steady, but Angela could hear the concern. "I fear my involvement is making things harder for you," he said. Angela swallowed, her throat raw. "People talk, they always have, but this," her voice broke. "They think I've traded dignity for money." There was a long pause, then Charles spoke quietly. "Angela, I've lived long enough to know people will always invent stories. You can't spend your life proving them wrong. You can only live in a way that proves you right." Angela closed her eyes. His words settled into her like balm, though the sting of the whispers remained. That night, Chloe found her mother sitting on the porch, staring into the darkness. She sat beside her, wrapping a blanket around them both. "Mom," Chloe said softly, "don't let them take this from you. You've given everything. If someone wants to give back, even a little, why shouldn't you let them?" Angela looked at her daughter, her eyes shimmering. "Because I don't want you to grow up thinking the world gives you something for nothing. I don't want you to think a man's money is the only path to freedom." Chloe shook her head. "I don't think that. I just think sometimes God sends help in ways we don't expect, and maybe this is one of those times." Angela didn't answer. The night was too full of questions, and her heart too full of doubt. Inside, Marcus's room pulsed with music, the bass a steady thud like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Chloe leaned against her mother's shoulder, whispering, "We'll be okay." Angela wrapped an arm around her daughter, holding her close. She wanted to believe it, but the weight of whispers pressed harder than ever. In the quiet, she remembered Daniel's hands, calloused but gentle, the way he used to say, "We'll find a way, Ang, we always do." But now she was alone in the finding, alone in the fight. And though a stranger had offered her a bridge, the world seemed determined to burn it beneath her feet. The first sign came late on a Friday night. Angela had just returned from her evening shift, the house dim except for the glow under Marcus's door. She paused, listening. His voice was low, urgent, muffled against the hum of bass. She couldn't catch the words, only the edge in his tone, the kind that cut sharp when someone thought no one was listening. When the door opened suddenly, Marcus froze, phone still pressed to his ear. His eyes met hers, guarded and hard. "Who were you talking to?" Angela asked quietly. "No one," he muttered, brushing past her toward the kitchen. Angela followed. "Marcus, please, don't shut me out." He yanked open the refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of soda. "You don't need to know everything I do, Ma. I'm not a kid." "You're still my son," she whispered. He slammed the door, the bottles inside rattling. "Yeah, your son who's never good enough. You and Chloe got your golden ticket now. Why do you care where I go?" Before she could answer, he stormed out, the screen door banging into the night. Angela stood frozen, her chest tight, memories rushing back uninvited. 10 years ago, a different night, a different door. Daniel had kissed her cheek, the faint smell of motor oil on his clothes. "Just an extra shift, Ang, I'll be back before midnight." He never came back. The call had come instead, a supervisor's voice flat with shock, an accident at the site. Scaffolding collapsed, no survivors under the weight of twisted steel. She remembered dropping the phone, the sound of Chloe crying in her crib, Marcus pounding his small fists on the couch yelling, "Where's Daddy?" Now, watching her son disappear into the dark, she felt the same hollow fear claw at her chest. Different danger, same ache. Angela sat on the porch steps, rocking slightly, whispering into the night air. "Lord, don't take him too. Don't let me lose my boy." When Marcus finally stumbled home near dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his clothes smelling faintly of smoke and liquor. He didn't speak, didn't meet her gaze, just disappeared into his room. The next morning, Chloe confronted him. "Where were you?" she demanded, blocking his way in the hallway. "None of your business," he snapped. "You're making it Mom's business. She doesn't sleep when you're out there. Do you even care what you're doing to her?" Marcus's face twisted with guilt and anger. "You don't get it, Chloe. You've always had it easy. Teachers love you, doors open for you. Me, Every time I try, they slam shut. So yeah, I hang out with guys who don't judge me. At least they have my back. Your back? Chloe's voice rose. Those guys will stab you in the back the second it benefits them. You're smarter than this, Marcus. Stop acting like you know everything, he shouted. You've got your fancy future paid for. You don't know what it's like to feel worthless every damn day. Angela stepped between them before the argument could explode further. Enough, she said, her voice trembling but firm. This family will not tear itself apart like this. Marcus's chest heaved. He glared at them both, then shoved past into his room, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Angela pressed her hand against her heart, her breath uneven. She turned to Chloe, who looked ready to cry. I can't reach him, Mom, Chloe whispered. Angela pulled her close, stroking her daughter's hair. We'll keep trying, baby. We have to. That night, unable to sleep, Angela found herself walking to the church at the end of the block. The doors were locked, but she sat on the stone steps beneath the shadow of the cross. She bowed her head, hands clasped tightly, and prayed aloud. God, you gave me 2 children. One's flying toward the sky, the other's sinking into the ground. I don't have the strength to hold them both. If I'm meant to break, take me, but please, please don't let me bury another. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying no answer, but in her heart she felt a flicker of the same stubborn resolve that had carried her through every shift, every bill, every long night. She would not give up on Marcus. Not now. Not ever. 2 days later, the phone rang. Angela answered, expecting a bill collector. Instead, a cold voice said, "This is Detroit PD. We have your son, Marcus Johnson. He's in custody." The world tilted. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. At the station, she found Marcus sitting behind glass, his face pale, his eyes dull. He looked younger than 24. He looked like the little boy who once clung to her hand crossing the street. Marcus, she breathed, tears blurring her vision. He wouldn't meet her eyes. The officer explained. Marcus had been in a car when a group of boys attempted to rob a liquor store. He hadn't gone inside, but he'd driven the car. Accessory, charges pending. Angela pressed her hand to the glass. Why, Marcus? Why? Finally, he looked at her, shame pouring from his expression. Because I'm tired of feeling like nothing. At least with them, I mattered. Angela's sob escaped before she could stop it. You matter, Marcus. You've always mattered. You are my son. You are your father's son. Don't you dare throw that away. For the first time in weeks, Marcus's hardness cracked. His shoulders slumped, his lip trembled. But the weight of consequences already hung heavy. Angela left the station with her soul torn open. Outside, she leaned against the brick wall, unable to stand on her own. The memory of Daniel's coffin lowering into the ground rose vivid and cruel. Her husband gone, her son slipping, her daughter holding on by sheer will. Angela whispered into the empty street, I can't do this alone. And though she didn't know it yet, someone had already heard her. The police station smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Angela sat hunched on a hard plastic chair, her purse clutched to her chest as if it were armor. Hours had passed since they brought Marcus in, and each minute stretched like a year. When the door swung open, she expected another officer. Instead, she saw Charles Anderson. Angela froze. What are you doing here? Charles adjusted his coat, his expression calm but resolute. I heard about Marcus. A friend of mine at the courthouse called. I came to help. Angela's instinct was to protest, to tell him this was her family's burden, not his, but exhaustion pinned her tongue. She had no fight left. Moments later, Charles was speaking to the desk sergeant, his voice steady, the kind of voice used to negotiating contracts worth millions. Angela watched in awe as papers were shuffled, calls made, signatures exchanged. By nightfall, Marcus was released into her custody, charges pending but no jail for now. When they stepped into the cold Detroit air, Marcus shoved his hands deep into his pockets, glaring at the pavement. Angela opened her mouth to thank Charles, but Marcus cut her off. I didn't ask for this, he spat. I don't need some rich old man bailing me out. Marcus, Angela said sharply, watch your tone. No, let him speak. Charles interjected quietly. His eyes rested on Marcus, steady and unflinching. Son, whether you asked or not, your mother was drowning. And when a person is drowning, you don't stand on the shore debating pride, you pull them out. Marcus's jaw tightened. Don't call me son, you're nothing to me. The words struck Angela like a slap, though they weren't aimed at her. She turned to her son, her voice shaking. Marcus, he just saved you from spending the night in a cell. Can you not see that? Marcus finally looked up, his eyes raw with something deeper than anger, shame. I didn't want you to have to beg for me, Ma, and now you did, in front of him. Angela reached for his arm, but he pulled away. You think I don't see it? Chloe gets her tuition check. I get handouts from some stranger. What am I, Mom? A failure you can't fix on your own? Her heart cracked at the word. Failure. That was how he saw himself. Not as the boy who once painted her handmade cards for Mother's Day, not as the son who held Chloe's hand crossing busy streets. Just failure. Angela's tears slipped free. You are not broken, Marcus. You are my child. I would carry you through fire if I had to. Marcus turned away, his shoulders rigid. Well, maybe I'd rather burn than be someone's charity case. He stalked down the block, disappearing into the shadows. Angela stood trembling in the bitter wind, Charles at her side. I'm sorry, she whispered. You have nothing to apologize for, Charles said gently. He's hurting. Anger is the mask he wears to keep from drowning in it. Angela wiped her eyes. But how much longer can I keep him from sinking? Charles didn't answer. His silence was heavy but kind, like a man who knew the answer wasn't simple. That night at home, Chloe confronted her brother the moment he returned. How could you? She demanded. Do you know what Mom went through tonight? Do you know how close you were to ruining everything she's worked for? Marcus's face hardened. At least I'm not selling us off to some stranger. Chloe's hands balled into fists. He's not a stranger. He's the only person besides Mom who's actually tried to help us. Help? Marcus scoffed. He's buying us, Chloe, and you're too blind to see it. Angela stepped between them, her voice low but sharp. Stop. Both of you, I can't. Her voice cracked. I can't watch this family tear itself apart. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus muttered something under his breath and slammed his bedroom door. Chloe dropped into a chair, her eyes glistening. Mom, she whispered, I don't understand why he hates so much. Angela sank down beside her, holding her hand. Because he's lost. And when people are lost, they strike out at the ones closest to them. But he's still our Marcus. I won't stop believing he can find his way back. Chloe leaned against her, but the tremor in her shoulders told Angela her daughter's hope was fraying too. Later that week, Charles invited Angela to meet him at a quiet cafe. She almost didn't go, but something in her needed a moment away from the storm. Over steaming cups of coffee, Charles spoke softly. I know Marcus resents me. I don't blame him. A young man wants to be the hero of his own story, not the rescue of someone else's. Angela sighed, staring at her hands. He thinks I've replaced his father, that I've betrayed his memory. Charles nodded slowly. When my son died, I thought I'd never be whole again. Grief makes orphans of the living. Marcus doesn't just miss his father, he misses the version of himself that had one. Angela swallowed hard, her eyes brimming. I don't know how to fix him. Charles reached across the table, his hand warm against hers. Maybe it's not about fixing him. Maybe it's about standing steady until he realizes he was never broken. The words settled deep, like a stone dropping into water. For the first time in weeks, Angela felt something close to peace. That evening, when she returned home, Marcus was sitting on the porch steps, head in his hands. The sight startled her. He hadn't waited for her in years. Marcus, she said softly. He didn't look up. I'm sorry, Ma, for everything, for making you cry, for making you choose between me and Chloe. Angela's throat tightened. She sat beside him, the cold wood creaking beneath their weight. You're my son, she whispered. There is no choice, there never was. He finally met her eyes, his voice breaking. I just don't know who I'm supposed to be. Angela cupped his face in her hands, just as she had when he was a boy. You're Marcus Johnson, my boy, that's enough. For the first time in a long while, he let her hold him. But deep down, Angela knew the battle wasn't over. One night's apology couldn't erase the pull of the streets, the sting of pride, or the weight of whispers still clinging to their lives. Still, as she held her son close under the Detroit sky, she allowed herself one fragile breath of hope. Because hope, no matter how fragile, was the only thing keeping her family from breaking completely. The week after Marcus's release passed in uneasy quiet. He stayed close to home, avoiding the corners where his friends lingered. He helped Angela carry groceries, even fixed the leaky faucet that had dripped for months. But there was a tension in him, like a storm cloud that hovered but hadn't yet broken. Angela cherished the fragile calm, but she knew better than to believe it would last. Shadows don't dissolve so easily. One evening, as she was folding laundry in the living room, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Charles, holding a brown paper bag that smelled faintly of roasted chicken and herbs. I thought you could use a night off from cooking, he said with a gentle smile. Angela hesitated. Inviting him inside felt like stepping across a line Marcus had drawn in the dirt. But when she glanced toward the kitchen, where Chloe sat with her textbooks spread wide, the choice felt simpler. The children needed a meal. She stepped aside. Chloe brightened instantly. "Mr. Anderson," she said, standing, "that smells amazing." "Charles," he corrected kindly. They set the table, and soon the house was filled with the warmth of food they hadn't tasted in months. Angela watched Chloe laugh, her shoulders lighter, her eyes brighter. For once, she looked like a girl her age instead of a soldier carrying a family's future. But Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening at the sight of Charles at their table. "What's he doing here?" Marcus asked flatly. "Eating dinner," Angela said, her tone firm. "With us." Marcus's eyes flicked to Charles, then to the food. He muttered something under his breath and disappeared into his room, slamming the door. Angela's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Charles shook his head. "Don't apologize for your son. Anger is a language pain speaks when it hasn't learned the words." Later, when Chloe had gone to her room, Charles lingered. He seemed restless, his gaze fixed on the faded photo of Daniel that hung on the wall. "Angela," he said finally, his voice low, "there's something I've never told you, about why I keep showing up." Angela set down the dish towel, sensing the weight of his words. "My son," Charles began, his throat tightening around the syllables, "was 23 when he died. Car accident. A drunk driver hit him head-on. It was quick, they said. Instant. But for me, it's been 10 years of slow bleeding." Angela's breath caught. She hadn't known. "I built businesses. I collected houses, cars, everything money could buy, but I couldn't protect him, and after he was gone, the silence was unbearable. My wife passed 2 years later, cancer, and suddenly I was a man with everything except the one thing that mattered." His hands trembled slightly. "When you helped me that night in the parking lot, you reminded me of her. Not just my wife, but my son too. The way you carried your pain quietly, but still reached out to someone else. I saw in you what I lost, a family that still fights to hold on." Angela felt tears sting her eyes. She lowered herself into a chair, overwhelmed by the honesty pouring from him. "I don't want to replace anyone," Charles said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Not your husband, not your children's father. But if I can help you, if I can help Chloe and even Marcus, it feels like a way to keep my son's memory alive, like I'm not letting grief win." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Angela finally whispered, "You've carried this alone all these years." Charles nodded. "And so have you." She reached across the table, her rough hand finding his. For once, she didn't think about what Marcus would say or what the neighbors would whisper. She thought only of two people who had lost too much, sitting in a kitchen that smelled of roasted chicken and quiet hope. The door creaked and Marcus's voice cut through the stillness. "So that's it, huh?" Angela jerked her hand back, guilt flushing her cheeks. Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with accusation. "You sit here holding hands with him while Dad's picture hangs right there," he snapped, pointing to the wall. "You think he'd be proud of this?" "Marcus, stop," Angela said quickly. "No." His voice cracked, sharp with grief disguised as fury. "You talk about family, about love, but you're letting some stranger walk in here and rewrite everything. Dad worked himself into the ground for us, and now you're replacing him with a checkbook and sad stories." Charles's face remained calm, but sorrow flickered in his eyes. "I'm not trying to replace anyone, Marcus." "Then stay away from us," Marcus barked. Angela stood, her voice shaking. "Enough! Your father is gone, Marcus. He's gone. And I have spent 10 years trying to keep this family alive without him. If you think that means I can't accept kindness, then you don't know how much I've carried." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. His lip trembled, but pride kept his tears locked away. He spun on his heel and stormed out the front door. The silence he left behind was unbearable. Angela collapsed into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Charles rose slowly. "I should go," he said softly. Angela looked up, torn. "I'm sorry, he doesn't understand." Charles shook his head. "He's grieving. Still, sometimes grief doesn't fade, it just changes shape. For me, it's silence. For him, it's anger." Angela felt her chest ache. "And for me, it's fear of losing him the way I lost his father." Charles's eyes softened. "Then let me stand with you in that fear. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Angela wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that trust could exist again. That help didn't always come with strings. But Marcus's words echoed in her mind, sharp as glass. "You're replacing Dad." As Charles left that night, Angela stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the street. Behind her, the house was quiet, but the fracture inside it had deepened. And though she clutched her arms tightly around herself, Angela felt as though she were holding together the crumbling walls of her life with nothing but her own strength. Angela waited for Marcus to come home that night, but he didn't. She sat on the porch until the streetlights blinked out, the cold biting her bones, her body aching from both work and worry. At dawn, she found herself still in the same chair, hands wrapped tight around a lukewarm cup of coffee. When the sound of footsteps finally came up the walk, she looked up to see Marcus. His hood was pulled low, his eyes bloodshot. He smelled faintly of smoke and gasoline, like the night had wrapped itself around him and refused to let go. "Don't start," he muttered, trying to slip past her, but Angela stood blocking the doorway. Her tired body trembled, not from fear but from a storm that had been building inside her for years. "You will listen to me, Marcus," she said, her voice low but unyielding. He froze. Something in her tone was different, sharper, stronger. Not the weary pleading of a mother desperate to keep the peace, but the voice of a woman who had carried too much for too long. "You think your anger makes you a man?" Angela's words cut through the morning air. "You think shutting me out, lashing at Chloe, hating Charles, hating me makes you strong? It doesn't. It makes you weak. And I will not watch you destroy yourself." Marcus's fists curled at his sides. "You don't get it, Ma. You've never been me. You've never walked into a job interview and seen their eyes already decide you're not good enough. You've never felt like every step you take, someone's waiting to tell you you'll fail." Angela stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You're right. I haven't been you. I've been worse. I've been the widow who had to tell her babies their father wasn't coming home. I've been the woman scrubbing toilets while her bones ached just to keep the lights on. I've been the mother holding 2 children by myself while the whole world whispered that I couldn't do it." Her voice cracked, but her spine held straight. "And you know what I did, Marcus? I kept walking, even when it broke me, even when I wanted to quit, because I didn't have the luxury of giving up." Marcus looked at her then, his eyes wide. He had seen his mother's tears before, her exhaustion, her gentleness. But this fire, this fierce light, was new. "You want to know why I let Charles help?" Angela continued, her voice trembling with both rage and love. "Because I will not let your sister lose her future to pride. And I will not let you drown just to prove you can swim alone. I have carried this family for 10 years, Marcus. And if you think I'm going to lay it all down because of your stubbornness, you are wrong." Her chest heaved, tears streaming freely now. "I love you, son, more than you will ever understand, but I will not let that love be your excuse to throw your life away." Marcus's mouth opened, then closed. His body shook with the weight of words he couldn't release. Finally, he whispered, "I feel like I'm losing you. To him, to everything. Like Dad's memory doesn't matter anymore." Angela's heart softened, but her voice stayed steady. She placed both hands on his shoulders, grounding him. "Your father is with us every day," she said, her tone fierce with conviction. "In you, in Chloe, in the roof I've fought to keep over our heads. He is not replaced. He never will be. But he is gone, Marcus. And if you keep clinging to the ghost of him, you'll miss the life that's still here waiting for you." The silence between them was heavy, the kind that pressed on the chest and left no room for lies. Marcus's lip trembled. His eyes brimmed, but the tears clung stubbornly, just like him. "Why does it hurt so much?" he whispered. Angela pulled him into her arms. For a moment, he resisted. Then he collapsed against her, shoulders shaking, his pride finally cracking under the weight of his grief. "Because you loved him," she murmured into his hair. "Because he was your father, and because life has been cruel in ways it shouldn't have been. But hurting doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself. It means you have to fight harder to live." They stood like that for a long time, mother and son, bound by loss but stitched together by a love that refused to die. When Chloe appeared in the doorway, she froze, eyes wide at the sight of her brother clinging to their mother. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling. She had prayed for this moment, and here it was, fragile, trembling but real. Marcus pulled away at last, wiping his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. Angela cupped his face again, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You don't have to fix it all at once. You just have to start by choosing differently, one day at a time, and if you stumble, I'll be here, always." He nodded, a small, broken gesture, but it was enough. That night, Angela lay awake staring at the ceiling. The confrontation had left her drained, yet strangely lighter. For the first time in months, she felt as though Marcus had let her touch the wound beneath his anger. But she knew the road ahead was still dangerous. One wrong turn, one bad night, could undo everything. She couldn't carry both her children forever. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, she whispered a prayer, not for strength this time, but for mercy. For Marcus to find his way, for Chloe to hold onto her dreams, for the weight of whispers to finally fade. In the darkness, her words floated upward like smoke. And though no answer came, she chose to believe that someone, somewhere, was listening. The morning after the storm in their house, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy silence of resentment, nor the brittle silence of slammed doors. It was fragile, like the pause after a long-held breath. Angela rose before dawn as always, the weight of years in her bones, but something in her heart felt lighter. When she returned from her shift, she found Marcus in the kitchen. He was standing awkwardly by the sink, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes. She stopped in the doorway. It had been years since she'd seen him help without being asked. "Morning," she said softly. He glanced at her, eyes weary but clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Morning, Ma." No apology, no speech, just those two words. But for Angela, it was enough. That afternoon, Marcus surprised her again. Instead of disappearing into the streets, he walked to the construction site down the block and asked for work. They gave him a chance sweeping debris, a humble start, but it was something. When he returned home that evening with dust on his clothes and sweat on his brow, Angela hugged him tight. He muttered, embarrassed, "Don't make a big deal out of it." But it was a big deal. To her, it was everything. Chloe, meanwhile, was filling out scholarship forms at the dining table, her brow furrowed, lips moving silently as she rehearsed answers for interviews. The check from Charles still sat in an envelope in Angela's drawer, untouched. She couldn't bring herself to cash it, not yet. One evening, Chloe looked up from her papers and asked, "Mom, do you ever wonder what life would have been like if Dad hadn't?" Her voice faltered. If he was still here, Angela's chest ached. "Every day," she admitted. "But wondering doesn't change where we are. What matters is what we do now." Chloe nodded, blinking back tears. "I just want to make you proud." Angela reached across the table, brushing her daughter's hand. "You already have, baby girl, more than you know." A week later, Charles came by again. He didn't bring gifts or checks this time, only a quiet smile and a bouquet of daisies. "They reminded me of spring," he said, handing them to Angela. "And I thought your house could use some spring." Angela placed them in an old mason jar, the yellow petals brightening the room more than any lamp could. Over dinner, a simple meal she insisted on cooking herself, Charles asked Marcus about his new job. To Angela's surprise, Marcus answered. Short sentences, wary eyes, but there was no venom in his tone. "That's honest work," Charles said gently. "My father started me sweeping floors in his warehouse. Hard work builds more than muscles. It builds pride." Marcus looked down, but Angela saw the faintest flicker of something soften in his expression. Later, after Chloe had excused herself to finish her essays and Marcus retreated to his room, Angela found herself alone with Charles on the porch. The night air was cool, the stars faint above Detroit's haze. "You didn't have to keep coming back," she said quietly. Charles smiled, his eyes tired but kind. "Maybe I did, not for obligation, Angela, for choice." She studied him, her hands folded in her lap. "You've already done more than enough." "And yet," he replied softly, "I want to do more, not just for Chloe or Marcus, for you." Angela's heart tightened. "Charles, I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said quickly. "I just want you to know that my place isn't in grand gestures or checks. It's in standing beside you if you'll let me." Angela looked away, tears stinging her eyes. The thought of allowing someone in again, after Daniel, after years of carrying everything alone, terrified her. But it also warmed her, like sunlight on skin long accustomed to cold. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "Then I'll wait," Charles said simply. They sat in silence after that, the quiet between them no longer heavy but tender, like the space where something new might grow. The weeks that followed brought small shifts. Marcus kept his job at the site, even if he grumbled about it. Chloe received a letter of congratulations. She'd been invited to interview for a full scholarship. Angela cried over the envelope before she even opened it. At church, the whispers hadn't vanished, but Angela found she no longer bent under them. She held her head higher, her children at her side. Let them talk, she thought. They hadn't lived her life, hadn't known her battles. One Sunday after service, an old neighbor approached her. "Angela," she said softly, "don't listen to what people say. We see you. We know how hard you've fought." Angela blinked back tears. "Thank you." For the first time in months, she felt something shift, not just inside her house, but inside herself. That evening, she found Marcus on the porch, staring out at the street. "You've been quiet," she said, settling beside him. He shrugged. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "About Dad, about this guy, Charles." Angela braced herself. "I still don't trust him," Marcus admitted. "But I see the way you smile when he's around. You haven't smiled like that in years." Angela's throat tightened. Marcus looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "If he makes you happy, Ma, I guess that's okay." Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For in that moment, with her son beside her, her daughter's future bright ahead, and the possibility of love not yet gone, Angela felt the first light of morning break through the long night of her life. It was faint, fragile, but it was hope. And for Angela Johnson, hope had always been enough to keep moving. The morning of Chloe's scholarship interview dawned cold but bright. Angela pressed her daughter's blouse one more time, her hands trembling as though the fabric were sacred. Chloe stood in the kitchen mirror, straightening her collar, her eyes alive with both nerves and determination. "You look perfect," Angela whispered. Chloe turned, her voice soft. "I look like you, Mom." Angela's eyes welled, but she smiled. "Then you'll do just fine." Marcus insisted on driving her that morning. His car wasn't much, an old pickup he'd borrowed from a foreman at the construction site, but he stood straighter behind the wheel, as though the responsibility itself lifted him. Angela watched from the porch as Chloe climbed in, waving back with a grin. For the first time in years, Angela's children looked like a team again. When they returned hours later, Chloe's laughter filled the house. She clutched a letter in her hands, eyes shining with tears. "They offered me the full scholarship," she cried, collapsing into Angela's arms. Angela sobbed, holding her daughter so tightly she feared she might never let go. "I told you, baby girl, I told you the world would see you." Even Marcus smiled, pulling Chloe into a rough hug. "Guess I'll be the proud big brother of a college girl." Angela wiped her tears, her heart swelling with something she had nearly forgotten how to feel: triumph. The weeks that followed carried a gentler rhythm. Marcus rose early for work, his back sore but his pride intact. He spoke less of anger and more of plans, saving for his own apartment, maybe learning a trade. Chloe prepared for college, her acceptance letters pinned proudly on the refrigerator. Each envelope was a reminder that dreams, once impossible, were now within reach. And Angela? She breathed a little easier. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer pressed so heavy. One evening, Charles invited them all to his home for dinner. Angela hesitated, but Chloe insisted, and even Marcus agreed, though with a reluctant shrug. The Anderson house was grand, with tall windows and polished wood, but Charles greeted them not as guests but as family. He showed Marcus the garage, full of tools and projects, and spoke to him with quiet respect about work and responsibility. He asked Chloe about her studies, listening intently, never once treating her ambition as childish. And to Angela, he offered something she hadn't felt in years: partnership, not in money or gifts, but in presence. He cleared the dishes with her, laughed softly at her jokes, and looked at her not as a woman worn down by life, but as someone who still had light left to give. Later, as they prepared to leave, Charles walked Angela to the porch. "You've carried so much for so long," he said gently, "but you don't have to carry it all alone anymore. If you'll let me, I'd like to walk this road with you." Angela looked at him, her heart pounding. For years she had defined herself by struggle, by sacrifice, by silence. The thought of opening that guarded place again terrified her. But when she thought of Chloe's laughter, Marcus's slow return to himself, and the way the daisies still bloomed bright in her kitchen, she realized something profound. She was allowed to want more than survival. She was allowed to want joy. Angela's voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Then walk with me, Charles, but not ahead, not behind, beside." He smiled, his eyes glistening. "Beside always." The months passed, and spring painted Detroit with new colors. Chloe left for college, her future wide open. Marcus kept his job and even began classes at night, determined to build something steady. Angela watched them both with pride, knowing Daniel's spirit lived on in their resilience. And for herself, she let hope in again. Not the fragile hope of survival, but the full hope of love, of peace, of mornings where the burden didn't feel so crushing. She still spoke to Daniel sometimes, in quiet moments. At his photograph on the wall, she whispered, "I kept my promise. I kept them safe, and I kept myself alive too." Life hadn't turned out the way she once dreamed, but it had given her a second chance at family, at love, at herself. And now, dear listener, if you've walked this journey with Angela, through her darkest nights and her brightest mornings, then you know the truth she discovered. That love is not just what we give to others, but what we allow ourselves to receive. That strength is not just in enduring alone, but in letting others stand beside us. And that no matter how heavy the whispers of the world, hope will always rise when we choose to believe in it. Thank you for being here, for listening, for carrying Angela's story in your heart. I hope it reminds you of your own strength or of the strength in someone you love. From my heart to yours, I wish you health, peace, and the kind of family happiness that carries you through every storm. Take care and remember, even in the darkest night, morning always comes.